2 or 3 turns nichrome wire. It provides an effective filtration barrier. So there's one. And the second one. And in this instance, we'll make do with just 2. And the real professional will always trim off any excess paper using a very sharp knife. And this will then be inserted, as it were, backwards through the subaceal, which ultimately will end up on the reaction flask. Now let's return to the reaction vessel just in the meantime. We have completely finished with any necessity for the dropping funnel and the reflux condenser, so these can now be removed. But first of all, it's necessary to connect the flask, which must remain accessible to the vacuum manifold, to the inert gas manifold rather. This must be connected to the line itself via the other inlet stopcock. Now we must remember though at this stage that this tubing here is full of oxygen, and first of all must be evacuated. And then ultimately flushed with argon. And to do that we need a more plentiful supply. Okay, now of course as usual we need an overpressure for this purpose. So in fact we don't need the overpressure in the flask, we can disconnect the flask from the manifold first. Pressure in here is still ambient. We now turn this. Now we can close off this tap because we no longer need a connection to the line via the reflux condenser, and open this one here. Now all we need to do is simply, well, first of all this one I think, remove the reflux condenser. Lift it clear of the joint. Again, there's a very rapid outflow of gas here. Place it somewhere safe and replace that joint with a subaceal, which of course can be vented. The dropping funnel we will replace with the subaceal, which has already been fitted with a filter stick. This is a large joint, so petrol soaked pipe cleaner to remove as much grease as possible, and then Subaseal in. Now in fact in this case the filter stick is acting as a vent, and we'll allow it to vent purely to flush any nitrogen, oxygen, air out of the system. And I need briefly to disconnect this to fit the sleeve Subaseal securely around the neck. Now that flushing is complete, we can insert the business end, the sharp end, into the delivery flask. This vent can now be removed. The only precaution that's necessary here is to make sure that this here never comes into contact with the liquid surface while the end is free of the flask. Now, the filter stick can be dipped into the liquid. But again, the professional will only dip it into the surface. He will never put it all the way to the bottom. It's much better to follow the liquid down as filtration proceeds. But of course, no liquid will be transferred while the pressure in these two flasks is the same. We need only disconnect this flask from the line and provide a vent, and as you see, filtration will occur smoothly. Now, it's very common practice to leave this vent in place all the time. This is in fact not necessary and can, in the case of very slow filtrations, lead to an ingress of oxygen, which is obviously undesirable. So provided the pressure in here is released periodically by inserting the vent, the filtration will continue to occur. And as the level in here drops, so we can lower the filter stick further and further into the flask. An exactly similar technique can be used to separate supernatant solutions from recovered, recrystallized products in cooled vessels, such as this. We already have the Subaseal fitted. Venting, plenty of argon, venting via mercury. And then inserted as before, and once we've created a pressure differential, we can expect to see the supernatant drain off from the product. Occasional adjustment of the filter stick to make sure it remains within the liquid. Dispense with the vent. Now, as the rate of filtration drops off, it's obviously necessary to release some pressure. And as you can see, fine red crystalline solid material left behind. Now, in order to recover this, one would ordinarily, in fact at this stage, rinse with some fresh solvent. dispense with any liquid still in the tube. But replace the Subaseal with a ground glass stopper, which we always do prior to evacuation. It's bad practice in general to evacuate a flask with a Subaseal fitted. A brand new Subaseal will withstand it. One Subaseal that's been used once or twice will allow sufficient oxygen in to destroy anything worth having that is air sensitive. So we'll allow that to flush for a second or two. And secure. And in order to ensure dry product, we would at this stage close both taps, open to vacuum, and then evacuate the flask. Cautiously, of course. And leave the flask and its contents under vacuum until we're confident that all traces of residual volatile material have been removed. A similar, indeed simpler technique is very useful when it comes to transferring liquid reagents or solutions from flask to flask. As for example here, if we wish to transfer our Greenyard reagent to the dropping funnel for subsequent addition to this organochromium compound. This time, instead of using a filter stick, we use a plain transfer tubing, which is exactly the same, except there is no barrier at the receiving end. So we already have an overpressure of mercury here. We'll insert transfer tubing first into the delivery flask, allow it a second or two to vent, flush out any unwanted air, and then into the receiving component. Now again, although we dip the transfer tubing into the Greenyard solution, nothing is flowing here, so we must isolate this flask from the line and then vent this part of the system in order to supply a pressure differential to drive the forced siphon. Not quite enough, obviously. And there we are, we can deliver our Greenyard solution to whichever volume we require. That's all good and well where we're using either a graduated delivery vessel or a graduated dropping funnel, but that will not always be the case. And it's usually just as satisfactory to perform this particular procedure using a syringe. So we'll just illustrate that too. Allow the system to vent properly. Return this to the line. Remove the tube. Syringe is best charged, as we did before, at mercury overpressure. So we can withdraw whichever volume we wish, say 10 cc's in this case. Now one of the points of illustrating this is to show a small precaution that ought to be taken when handling air-sensitive compounds by syringe. It's very important upon withdrawing the syringe that you pull a bit of argon, or in the case of nitrogen, some of that, into the syringe needle. If you don't do that, and if the air-sensitive liquid extends all the way down to the end of the needle, then the end of the needle may be blocked by hydrolysis or oxidation products at the end during the transfer through the air, and a syringe full of pyrophoric material which is blocked at one end is a very worrying item to be holding on to. So this way we just inject as such. We can just put the residue in there. And again, if it's air sensitive, the sensible thing to do is to flush nitrogen or argon back into the needle. This is a little experimental refinement to which some of you may find you have access. This is a syringe tap, which is again very useful under these circumstances. The syringe I was using before had previously been flushed, but ordinarily one would flush one's syringe a couple of times. Like so. And then charge as before. The advantage here is that once we have withdrawn a given volume, adjusted that volume, say to 8 cc's in this case, then allowed a backflush of nitrogen, we can then close off the system completely just by closing off the stopcock. That way we have much less problem with handling as we transfer one to the other. And then all that's required is that we release the stopcock, deliver our volume of solution, and then again allow the syringe to backflush, and again close it off. So we have perfect safety, even with the most inflammable solutions. Well, we have been drying our solid organoiron product under vacuum, and this is an ideal opportunity for a final word about securing solid or indeed solution samples when they have to be removed from the line and stored somewhere else overnight. Well, first of all, we must let this down to the inner atmosphere rather than the vacuum, so we require mercury overpressure. So again, close off both stopcocks, open to argon, and then carefully control the ingress of argon without allowing any suckback. Well, that's it. Now for storage, ambient atmosphere is best, atmospheric pressure, so we will just return it to the oil bubbler. Now, obviously, to avoid any oxygen or water finding its way into the flask overnight, all joints must be thoroughly greased, so check for streaks. But of course, needless to say, all joints must be securely bound by elastic bands to avoid needless tears and heartbreak the following morning when it has gone dark green. This has a screw-in stopcock, of course, self-securing. If you're using glass stopcock, then the key itself should also be secured by an elastic band once it has been closed off. Remember, if air can fix you, it will. But at the end of the day, I still think there's something particularly magical about air and water in their proper place and in the appropriate proportions.